Beatrice had not planned to bring her lawyer to the dinner party. She was 31 years old, sitting at a beautifully set table in a grand dining room in Charleston, South Carolina, surrounded by her husband's family, their closest friends, and the particular social architecture of a gathering designed to impress. She had come prepared for the usual, the sideways comments, the carefully phrased questions that carried small, sharp edges, the performance of welcome that had always contained, just beneath its surface, a persistent current of disapproval. What she had not expected was for her mother-in-law Vivienne to stand up, to raise her glass, and to deliver, in front of 30 people, a speech that used the words gold digger with the particular confidence of a woman who believed she was completely untouchable. Beatrice sat completely still through every word. Her hands were in her lap. Her expression did not change, because 3 seats to her left, also sitting completely still, was a woman named Claire Hendricks, Beatrice's attorney, invited that evening as a family friend, present for reasons Vivienne was about to understand completely. When Claire set down her dessert fork and spoke 4 sentences into the silence that followed Vivienne's speech, the room changed in a way that could not be undone. And Vivienne's certainty that she was untouchable evaporated entirely. She stood up at her own dinner party and called Beatrice a gold digger in front of 30 people. What she didn't know was that Beatrice's lawyer was sitting 3 seats away and had been preparing for exactly this moment for 18 months. If you have ever been publicly underestimated by someone who believed they were untouchable, subscribe right now. What happens next? You cannot miss a single second of it. My name is Beatrice. I was 31 years old, living in Charleston, South Carolina, and I had built every single thing I owned with my own 2 hands and my own relentless work ethic. No inheritance, no family money, no connections handed to me through someone else's last name. I had launched my interior design firm 6 years before I met Edward, had grown it client by client, project by project, through the specific unglamorous combination of talent and discipline that actual business building requires. I was proud of what I had created. Genuinely, quietly, deeply proud. Which is why being called a gold digger by a woman who had never once examined what I had built hurt in the particular way that precise injustice always hurts. Not just painfully. Specifically, Edward was not what I expected when I walked into the architectural firm's event where we first met. I had built enough of a client reputation by then to move through Charleston's professional social circuit regularly, and that circuit contained its share of men from established families who wore their inheritance like a second skin, comfortable and unconscious. Edward was different. He was warm without performance, curious without agenda, the kind of man who asked follow-up questions because he had actually listened to your first answer. He told me about his family on our 3rd date, the Charleston name, the old money, the mother whose approval operated as the family's organizing principle. He said it without pride or apology, simply as information I deserved to have. I appreciated the honesty. I had no idea yet what that information actually meant for my life. I met Vivienne 6 weeks into dating Edward, a Sunday lunch at the family home, elegant and unhurried, the kind of meal that functions as an audition dressed as hospitality. She was impeccably presented and socially precise in the way of women who have spent decades curating every impression they make in every room they enter. She was warm to me in a way that contained, just beneath its surface, a current I could feel but not yet named. Something evaluative. Something that had reached a conclusion before I had finished my first sentence. She asked about my work with the particular interested tone of someone performing curiosity, and when I described my firm, my clients, my 6 years of independent building, something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite what her expression was doing. I noticed it. I filed it. I said nothing. Marriage to Edward was genuinely good. I want to be clear about that because the story of what Vivienne did exists inside a marriage that was real and solid and worth everything it cost to protect. Edward and I built a life together with the ease of 2 people whose values and rhythms were genuinely compatible. What existed alongside that good marriage was Vivienne's campaign, conducted in the background, in the social spaces surrounding our life, with the patience of a woman playing a long game she believed she had already won. Comments at family gatherings, observations at social events, the particular language of a woman who had decided what I was and was methodically, elegantly communicating that decision to everyone in her considerable social orbit. My design firm had 6 years of history before Edward's last name meant anything to me personally. My first client had been a retired professor who needed her Victorian house restored. I had done it on a modest budget with the kind of attention that produced a result she described to 3 friends who each called me within a month. That was how it had grown. referral by referral, project by project. By the time I met Edward, my client list included 8 of Charleston's most significant residential properties, not because of connections, but because of work. My pre-marriage income was documented, consistent, and entirely self-generated. The gold digger narrative Vivienne had constructed and was distributing across Charleston's social circuit had one significant problem. It had no relationship whatsoever to the actual facts of my actual life. Edward occupied the most difficult position in this particular geography, genuinely loving a wife his mother had decided to oppose, genuinely loving a mother whose opposition he could not bring himself to directly confront. He was not a weak man. He was a man caught between 2 loyalties he had never been required to prioritize before, and who was handling that requirement with considerably more avoidance than the situation deserved. He told me he had spoken to Vivienne. I believed him. I also understood, watching the comments continue across 18 months without consequence, that whatever he had said had not been said with enough weight to land. I did not push him. I was building something of my own in the background, and I needed him, for the time being, to remain exactly where he was. I called Claire on a Thursday afternoon 14 months into our marriage, not in crisis, not after a specific incident, but with the calm intention of a woman who had been watching a pattern long enough to understand its direction. I laid out everything I had been quietly documenting, the dates, the settings, the language, the witnesses. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 questions, both precise, both legally specific. Then she said something that confirmed I had been right to call her when I did, rather than waiting for the situation to escalate further on Vivienne's terms. "You have already identified the pattern," Claire said. "Now we document it properly. And we wait for her to choose her moment." I already had a feeling about which moment that would be. Vivienne's annual dinner party was the most anticipated event in a certain circle of Charleston society. 30 guests, formal table settings, the kind of evening where the silverware was polished and the conversation was weaponized with equal care. I had attended twice before. Both times I had navigated the evening with the composed efficiency of someone who has studied the terrain carefully and knows exactly where the dangerous ground is. This year felt different before it began. Something in the way Vivienne had extended the invitation, warmly, specifically, with an emphasis on how much she wanted the whole family present, carried a quality I had learned to recognize. The particular warmth of someone who has already decided what the evening is for. I called Claire 3 days before the dinner party. Not with a specific legal request, simply to tell her I was attending Vivienne's gathering and that my instincts, which had served me reliably for 2 years, were telling me something was coming. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, very simply, "Would it help if I came?" I considered it for exactly 4 seconds. Claire had attended 2 previous social events with Edward and me. She was known to his family as a friend, her professional identity unremarkable in that context. Her presence would be natural, unremarkable. And if my instincts were correct about what Vivienne had planned for that evening, having Claire in the room was the most important decision I could make. The evening began with the elegant ease that Vivienne produced effortlessly: cocktails in the front parlor, fresh flowers arranged with professional precision, guests arriving in the particular social rhythm of people who attended these gatherings regularly and knew their roles within them. I wore a dress I had chosen deliberately. Nothing that could be characterized as flashy, nothing that could be characterized as insufficient. The specific middle ground of a woman who understands that in certain rooms her appearance will be evaluated and has decided to give that evaluation nothing useful to work with. Edward stayed close. Claire moved through the room with the easy warmth of a guest who belongs, chatting with a judge's wife, laughing at something a retired senator said, completely unremarkable in the best possible way. We were midway through the main course when Vivienne stood. The table quieted immediately, because Vivienne's table always quieted when she stood, the 30 years of social authority she had accumulated producing that particular obedience without requiring her to ask for it. She raised her glass. Her expression was composed and warm and entirely rehearsed in the way of someone who had practiced this specific moment. She began with the kind of toast that starts broad: gratitude for the gathering, appreciation for the season, the language of a gracious hostess establishing her own benevolence before she arrived at her actual purpose. I set my fork down quietly. Beside me, Edward had gone very still. 3 seats to my left, Claire continued eating with the unhurried calm of someone who is paying complete attention. Vivienne turned her gaze toward me midway through the speech, and I want to describe that moment precisely, because the way she looked at me was itself a statement. Not hostile exactly. Something more considered than hostility. The particular expression of a woman who believes she is performing a necessary public service and is entirely comfortable with the discomfort it produces in its subject. She spoke about her son's legacy, about the family's history in Charleston, about the importance of ensuring that history was protected from people whose interest in it was financial rather than genuine. She did not use the phrase gold digger immediately. She constructed toward it carefully, deliberately, and then delivered it with a smile. Clearly, into the silence of 30 people who had just heard exactly what she intended them to hear. I did not look at Vivienne while she spoke. I looked at the room, because the room was the point. The room was always the point, and I had learned from 2 years of navigating her campaign that understanding the audience mattered as much as understanding the speaker. What I saw across those 30 faces was a spectrum. Genuine shock in some, guests who had not anticipated this specific escalation, even from a woman they knew to be capable of considerable social cruelty. Discomfort in others, people who had perhaps heard variations of this characterization in smaller settings, and were now watching it arrive publicly and finding the experience more confronting than they had expected. And in a small number of faces, the particular stillness of people who were simply waiting to see what happened next. Claire set down her dessert fork. The sound it made against the china was small, barely audible, but in the silence that had followed Vivienne's speech it carried. She looked at Vivienne with the pleasant, focused expression of someone about to say something professional in a social setting, and finding no contradiction between those two things. Then she spoke. She introduced herself by name and by title attorney at law. She noted that she had been present for the complete statement just delivered. She informed Vivienne and the room that she represented Beatrice in an ongoing legal matter directly relevant to the characterization just made publicly. And she said that Vivienne's statement this evening had been noted, witnessed, and would be addressed through the appropriate formal channels at the earliest available opportunity. Then she picked up her dessert fork and continued eating. 18 months before the dinner party, I sat at my desk on a Tuesday evening and opened a fresh document on my laptop. I titled it simply with the date. Then I wrote down exactly what had happened at Edward's family brunch that morning, the comment Vivienne had made in front of 3 of his colleagues about wives who married into established families for reasons other than love. She had not used my name. She had not needed to. Everyone at that table had understood precisely who she was describing, and had looked at me with the particular sideways attention of people absorbing information they had just been given about someone sitting among them. I wrote every word down, closed the laptop, and opened it again the following morning to add the names of every person present. What became clear to me over the following months, as the entries in my document accumulated with a consistency that removed any possibility of coincidence, was that Vivienne's campaign was not impulsive. It was constructed. Each comment arrived in a social setting where witnesses were present, but the comment itself was deniable, wrapped in concern, delivered with warmth, framed as maternal rather than malicious. Each incident built incrementally on the previous one, establishing a narrative across multiple audiences over time, rather than making a single dramatic statement that could be directly confronted and addressed. This was the work of someone who understood social mechanics precisely, and had applied that understanding with patience and deliberate intent. Recognizing it as architecture rather than behavior was the moment I understood what I was actually dealing with. I had known Claire professionally for 4 years before I walked into her office with my documentation folder and laid it on her desk. She was a civil litigation attorney, sharp, experienced, the kind of professional whose reputation was built on cases she had won rather than cases she had settled for convenience. I gave her the complete picture, the timeline, the specific incidents, the witness names, the pattern I had identified. She read through the folder without speaking. When she finished, she looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said something I had needed to hear from someone with her credentials. "This is not a difficult mother-in-law situation, Beatrice. What you're describing has a legal name, and you have documented it better than most investigators would." Claire recommended a documentation protocol that went beyond what I had already established, more precise, more legally structured, capturing the specific elements that would matter in a formal proceeding. Date and time of every incident, physical location and setting. Complete list of witnesses present with their relationship to both parties. Exact language used, not paraphrased, not summarized, but the precise words in the precise order they were delivered. The context in which the comment arrived and the specific way it was framed, and my own response or deliberate non-response to each incident. I applied this protocol retroactively to every previous entry I had made and went forward with a precision that my professional background made almost automatic. The document grew steadily. It became something considerably more powerful than a private record. Here is what made Vivienne's gold digger characterization not merely cruel, but specifically, documentably false. My interior design firm had been operating for 6 years before I met Edward. My client roster included 8 of Charleston's most prominent residential properties, not because of Edward's family name, but because of work I had produced before his name meant anything to me. My pre-marriage financial statements showed an income that compared favorably to Edward's own at the same point in our relationship. I had never asked Edward for money. I had never accessed his family's resources. I had signed a prenuptial agreement without negotiation or objection because my attorney had reviewed it and I had nothing to protect myself from. Vivienne had constructed a narrative about a woman she had never once examined. A year after our first meeting, Claire called me on a Friday afternoon with the assessment I had been waiting for. The documentation had reached a threshold, not just personally significant but legally actionable. What we had assembled constituted a sustained defamation campaign conducted across multiple social settings over 12 months, with identified witnesses at each incident and a clear pattern of intent visible in the construction and escalation of the statements made. Claire told me that if the campaign continued, particularly if it escalated to a more public or formal setting, we would have grounds for a civil defamation case that she would be genuinely confident taking to a Charleston courtroom. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to be ready, and I wanted to wait for the moment Vivienne chose for herself. When Vivienne's dinner party invitation arrived, I read it 3 times. Then I called Claire. The gathering, 30 guests, Charleston establishment, the most socially prominent audience Vivienne had ever had available to her, represented exactly the kind of escalation Claire had described as the probable next move of someone whose smaller settings had produced no visible consequences. I had given Vivienne 18 months of non-response. 18 months of absorbing each incident without visible reaction, which she had consistently interpreted as permission to continue and escalate. The dinner party was where that escalation was going to arrive. I could feel it with the particular certainty of someone who has been paying close attention for a very long time. I told Claire the date. She checked her calendar. She said she would be there. Edward drove home from the dinner party without speaking for the first 12 minutes. And I know it was 12 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard with the particular focused calm of someone giving another person the space they need to arrive at what they need to say. Charleston moved past the windows in its nighttime way, familiar streets, warm light in old windows, the city entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside one of its grand dining rooms. When Edward finally spoke, his voice was quiet and entirely without its usual careful neutrality. He said he was sorry. Not the reflexive sorry of someone managing a moment, the specific, considered sorry of a man who understood exactly what he was apologizing for and why it had taken him far too long to arrive there. We sat in our kitchen until past midnight, the kind of conversation that a marriage either survives or doesn't, the kind that requires both people to be more honest than comfortable and more present than defended. Edward said things he had never said before, about the years of watching his mother's campaign and choosing peace over accountability, about the specific ways that choice had prioritized his own comfort over my dignity, about what Claire's 4 sentences had clarified for him in a way that 2 years of private conversations had not. I listened to all of it without interruption. Then I said what I needed to say, not with anger, but with the direct honesty of a woman who had waited long enough for this particular conversation and intended to use it completely. She called at 8:15 the following morning, early enough to signal urgency, late enough to suggest she had spent the night constructing her approach. Her voice was controlled and warm in the particular register she deployed when managing situations that had escaped her preferred parameters. She described the previous evening as a misunderstanding, said her toast had been taken out of context, that her concern for Edward had been expressed clumsily, that Claire's response had been a dramatic overreaction to a mother's genuine love. She did not say the word sorry. She did not acknowledge the specific language she had used. She described a version of the previous evening that bore a careful, deliberate resemblance to what had actually occurred while removing every element that mattered. I listened completely. Then I told her to contact Claire's office. Claire filed the formal defamation notice 3 days after the dinner party, a precisely constructed legal document that named the dinner party statement as the culminating public incident in an 18-month documented campaign. The filing cited specific dates, specific settings, specific language, and the names of witnesses present at each documented incident. The dinner party section alone listed 28 of the 30 guests as potential witnesses to the most severe and explicit statement in the complete record. Claire described it to me as a filing designed to communicate two things simultaneously: the seriousness of what had been documented and the completeness of the preparation behind it. Vivienne's attorney received the notice on Thursday afternoon. He called Claire's office before the end of the business day. Charleston's social establishment processed what had happened at Vivienne's dinner party with the particular efficiency of a community whose primary currency is information, and whose circulation of that information is both constant and precise. 30 people had been present. 30 people had heard Vivienne's statement. 30 people had watched Claire set down her dessert fork and deliver 4 sentences that rearranged the temperature of the room completely. By the following weekend, the story had moved through the city's social network with a thoroughness that no subsequent management could fully address. I heard about conversations I had not been present for: the retired judge who had attended expressing strong views, the wives of 2 of Edward's business associates discussing what they had witnessed, the quiet but significant recalibration of how Vivienne was perceived in rooms she had always believed she controlled. The call between Vivienne's attorney and Claire lasted 40 minutes, Claire told me afterward, with the measured satisfaction of someone who had built a case she believed in completely and was watching that belief confirmed in real time. Vivienne's representation had reviewed the documentation file. They had seen the 18 months of dated, witnessed, precisely recorded incidents. They had seen the financial records establishing Beatrice's pre-marriage independence. They had seen the dinner party section with its 28 potential witnesses. The attorney had arrived at the call, Claire said, already knowing the fundamental shape of what he was dealing with. The conversation had been professional and relatively brief. His client's position had very little defensible ground, and the documentation had made that clear before a single formal proceeding had occurred. Edward requested the meeting with his mother himself, without my prompting, without Claire's recommendation, as his own decision was made in the days following the dinner party. He told me the night before he was going that he needed to have a conversation he should have had 2 years earlier, and that he intended to have it honestly and completely regardless of how it was received. He came home 3 hours later, quieter than when he left, the particular quiet of someone who has said difficult true things to a person they love and is sitting with the weight of having finally said them. He told me the conversation had been hard. He told me his mother had cried. He told me he had not retreated from a single word. Then he sat beside me and held my hand for a long time without speaking. Claire presented the complete defamation case with the methodical confidence of an attorney who has spent 18 months building something she believes in completely. The documentation record was submitted in full, every dated entry, every witness name, every specific incident mapped chronologically from the first brunch comment to the dinner party statement that had brought 30 people into the room as simultaneous witnesses. The financial records establishing my pre-marriage independence were submitted alongside my firm's 6-year revenue history, my pre-marriage asset statements, my client contracts predating Edward by half a decade. The complete picture of a financially independent woman whose independence Vivienne had never examined before constructing a narrative designed to erase it. Claire described the submission to me afterward as the cleanest defamation record she had presented in 14 years of civil litigation practice. Vivienne's attorney requested 2 weeks to review the complete submission before responding formally, a timeline Claire granted without objection because the documentation required no urgency on our part. It was complete. It was irrefutable. And every day Vivienne's representation spent inside that record was another day they understood more clearly what their client had done and how thoroughly it had been documented by the woman she had spent 18 months attempting to diminish. When the attorney called Claire at the end of the 2-week period, his opening sentence told both of them everything necessary about where things stood. He said his client was prepared to discuss the resolution. He did not suggest they contest the record. He did not propose alternative interpretations of the documented incidents. He simply said his client was ready to talk. The settlement negotiation took 3 sessions, professional, structured, conducted entirely between attorneys, with Edward and me receiving updates from Claire after each meeting. Vivienne agreed to a formal public retraction of the gold digger characterization, written, signed, and distributed to every guest who had attended the dinner party. She agreed to a written acknowledgement that the characterization had been false, that Beatrice's financial independence was documented and genuine, and that the statements made across the preceding 18 months had been without factual basis. The financial terms Claire described as appropriate given the duration and the public nature of the most severe incident. I reviewed the final settlement document on a Thursday afternoon, read every word carefully, and signed it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had prepared for exactly this outcome. The retraction arrived in the mailboxes of 30 Charleston households on a Tuesday morning, the same 30 households whose residents had sat at Vivienne's dinner table and heard the original statement delivered with a raised glass and a confident smile. It was formally worded, legally precise, and entirely unambiguous in its content. I did not read about its reception through any direct account. I had no interest in monitoring how individual recipients processed it. But Claire received 3 calls from attorneys representing guests who wanted to understand whether any further proceedings were anticipated. Edward's phone was quieter than usual for several days, in a way that suggested conversations were happening in his professional circle that had not yet found their way to him directly. The retraction had landed. In the same room the original statement had. What the dinner party and everything that followed did to our marriage did not damage it, it clarified it. That distinction matters enormously. The 2 years before that evening had contained a persistent low-grade tension between us that neither of us had fully named, the tension of a man trying to love his wife and his mother simultaneously, without requiring either to cost him the other. The dinner party ended that particular impossible balance. Not because Vivienne had been held legally accountable, but because Edward had finally chosen, clearly and without retreat, where he stood. A marriage that has been tested by something genuine and survived honestly is a different and stronger thing than one that has only ever existed in comfortable conditions. Ours had been tested. We had both shown up for it. That changed everything. 4 months after the settlement, a Charleston business publication ran a profile of my interior design firm, one of a series on the city's independent women business owners. The piece covered my firm's history, my client list, my revenue growth over 6 years, and the specific projects I was most proud of. It was thorough and well-written and entirely focused on the work I had built. Several of Vivienne's closest social circle read that publication regularly. I knew this because Edward had mentioned it in passing years earlier. I did not engineer the profile's timing. I had been approached for the interview before the dinner party had ever occurred. But the timing, arrived at entirely without my management, produced an irony so precise and complete that Claire called me the morning it published simply to say, "Well, there it is." So here is what I want to leave with you directly, without decoration, from someone who spent 2 years being called something false by someone powerful enough to make other people believe it. Document everything. Not because you are planning a legal case from the beginning, but because documentation is the practice of taking your own experience seriously, of refusing to allow someone else's narrative about you to go uncontested in the only record that matters, the true one. Vivienne believed that social position made her untouchable. What she had not accounted for was a woman who understood that preparation is its own form of power. Claire's 4 sentences changed that room. But 18 months of quiet, precise, unrelenting documentation is what made those 4 sentences possible. Do the work, before the moment arrives, because the moment always arrives.